Thanks, we needed that. That was, whoa. Let's keep that light shining at least until November 8th, shall we? Good morning. And welcome. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church. The autumn. The autumn always invites deep reflection, does it not? On the ebb and flow of life. The old fades amidst brilliant colors. A fallow period follows in winter, and then, of course, the miracle of new life in spring. We know the rhythm of nature, which is also mirrored in all of life. And yet the personal experience of life fading is often met with the poignancy coming to terms with realizing impermanence. One way or another, death or its cousins, old age, illness, accidents, separation, loss, hang over all of us. Nobody is immune. Our world is unstable, unpredictable. It operates to a great degree, and despite incredible scientific advancement, it operates outside our ability to control it. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service this morning, turning our hymn books, please, to number 128. All life is a gift to build the common good. How simple and how powerful those words are. I think that's really where we stand now, about whether or not this gift of life will be devoted to building the common good. We will know soon. I read recently, this sounds really odd, but I read recently that Buddhist monks often contemplate the photos of corpses in various stages of decay. That was news to me. They don't advertise these kinds of things. It wouldn't draw many people, I think, to the Sangha. In fact, the Buddha himself recommended what is called corpse meditation. This body, too, students were taught to say about their own bodies. This body, too. Such is its nature, such is its future, such is its unavoidable fate. Paradoxically, this meditation is intended as a key to better living. It makes disciples aware of the transitory nature of their own physical lives and stimulates a realignment between momentary desires and existential goals. In other words, it makes one ask, am I making the right use of my scarce and precious life? Let us unite our minds and our hearts in the spirit of prayer and meditation and reflection. O Spirit of life and love, life is a brief interval between birth and death. It's composed of a few notes between prelude and postlude. It's a drama quickly played between the rising and falling of a curtain. What shall we do with this interval of time? What combination of notes shall we play? What thespian mask shall we wear? Why are we so careless with time? Why do we not sound the music of our hearts? Why do we not feel the stage beneath our feet? Is it not time to enjoy the interval? Is it not time to play our own melody? Is it not time for us to act our part? Life is a brief interval between birth and death. But may we celebrate that interval with joy. May we sing the song that belongs to us. And may we act as if our lives depended on it, because it does. Amen.
Good morning. I want to begin with another special thank you to our musical guests this morning, Merrill Smith on piano, Kaya Perine on bass, and John Flanders on flute and clarinet. Thank you guys so much. A ways back when I was talking with David Owens about this service and realized the timing of it, so close to Samhain and Halloween and All Saints and All Souls and Dia de los Muertos, all of these rich holidays that invite us to look at death and turning and how we let go. One of the images that came up for me was that of the New Orleans jazz funeral. And I went, ooh, what would it be like to have some of that? And so here we have some of that. You'll hear more, be treated to more later. And who knows, by the end of the service, we might be doing our own little dancing in the aisles. We'll see how we're moved. It also connects with the fact that our high school group is planning on doing its service trip in New Orleans this coming summer. So it's a way to keep us in touch with that intention and that exploring those cultures. This time of year so marked with acknowledging, as I said, not only harvest of crops, but of life, often reminds me of this poem by Mary Oliver that I'll begin with today. It's called In Blackwater Woods. And she writes, "Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment, and the long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this. The fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your life depends upon it. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go." Our second reading this morning comes to us from another contemporary source, a Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed. It's titled, "Let Me Die Laughing." We are all dying, our lives always moving towards completion. We need to learn to live with death and to understand that death is not the worst of all events. We need to fear not death, but life. Empty lives, loveless lives, lives that do not build upon the gifts that each of us have been given, lives that are like living deaths, lives in which we never take the time to savor and appreciate, lives in which we never pause to breathe deeply. What we need to fear is not death, but squandering the lives we have been so miraculously given. So, let me die laughing, savoring one of life's crazy moments. Let me die holding the hand of one I love and recalling that I tried to love and was loved in return. Let me die remembering that life has been good and I did what I could. But today, just remind me that I'm dying so that I can live and savor and love with all my heart. This completes our readings this morning. Take us to church. You just done been to church. Thank you. Thank you. And wow, it was perfect. Remind me that I am dying so I can live and savor. And then that, right? Right? It's not always easy. It's not always easy to savor in the face of how much pain and suffering we have and we see. And yet it's our task, right? And we gather in community to be reminded of this sacred task of living, of this precious life, to be in community, to seek together and say, what is your life? And as Tom's reading suggested, this body too. This body too. This body, this corporate body has been gathering here for over 125 years. And it's wonderful to be a part of it with you for this year that I have left with you as a consulting minister. For those I've not yet met, I'm Reverend Matthew Cockrum, a consulting minister here, and along with Tom Goldsmith and the staff, and with you, it's an honor to serve the mission and ministries of this place, because that's what we're here for, is to serve those things. In your bulletin, you will see any number of offerings that are coming in the coming weeks, opportunities for you to engage that mission and ministries, about growing and deepening your spiritual and intellectual journey, about helping to build a more just and progressive world. Just to remind you of a couple of those, first of all, the 28th season of Jazz Vespers kicks off tonight in this space at 7:30. So if you are interested in this kind of music, there's a whole series. It's listed in your bulletin. It is a free will offering, but it fills up fast and is usually standing room only. So if you're interested, bring your friends, and it's a great time. On Monday night, I'll be offering a free drop-in session called Seeking the Sources. We're looking at the sources of our liberal tradition and engaging in spiritual exercises to help us explore those more deeply. Next Saturday is going to be a busy Saturday. We've got a class called Caring for Persons Under Stress, including yourself, that's being taught by Reverend Harold Strawn and put forth by the Caring Committee, especially at this time of year when the holidays are upon us and, of course, the election season. You might need some ways to cope with some stress in your life, right? And so this is a free class. There's childcare provided. Just ask that you bring a brown bag lunch and something to share or something to drink. That'll be from 10 to 2 in Elliott Hall. And then after that, you can go to the swap, the holiday swap with Sen Esteban, and bring some things that are good holiday gift items, and you can either bring them here or bring them here and then go over there and participate in the swap. Lots of great opportunities. Last but not least, a reminder that there are several events being sponsored by or co-sponsored by our own environmental ministries this week in support of Standing Rock in North Dakota. The first of which is tomorrow at 9 a.m. So it didn't make it into your bulletin, but there are a number of flyers out at the environmental ministries table in Elliott Hall. So I hope that you will take the time to avail yourself of those activities that speak to your soul and that help this place to do its work. For now, though, we're going to invite the offering, and as the ushers come forward to receive that, I invite you to offer yourself to your neighbors and friends while we enjoy some more jazz. So how do you live with the losses in your life? And do you dance with death? Of course, loss and death mark us all, and our dances may be shuffling more than eloquent, not necessarily so graceful or choreographed. In these tense times, as we witness and experience continued political turmoil, fears about the future, depending upon who's elected, what kind of unrest will we see, who will leave the country, who will stage a coup. We laugh, but really, haven't you heard it? And isn't the fear and the anger and the loss and the danger of a vision that might not come to fruition everyone's in some way? So how do we live really with loss and dance with death in these times? As we witness death and destruction in our cities, as we strive and struggle to understand and dismantle militarization and racism and white privilege and supremacy, as we see protesters at Standing Rock, and as we struggle to continue doing our justice work and to make sense of and atone for centuries of environmental disregard, it can be tempting to become hard-hearted or apathetic, or to intensify our stridency, or to be so weighed down, such that living with loss becomes a life sentence of simply grin and bear it. It seems that in light of all of this doom and gloom, the fear and danger on top of just the everyday challenges and losses for each of us, the losses of living, that it's all that much more important and critical even to stop and take stock of how we are living with our loss. Not to wallow, but to notice and to be mindful, to be intentional, to practice becoming more realistic about how we encounter the world and the unconscious fear and grief that drives us, and to learn to live more lightly with that, and perhaps even to dance. Her name was Dee Dee Rainbow. To thousands of people in Seattle, she was just the Rainbow Lady. I was fortunate enough to be invited to her bedside just after she'd died. She had been a lifelong member of University Unitarian Church there in Seattle. She had married one of its ministers and was the mother of another one of its ministers. And her name described her to a T, Dee Dee Rainbow. It was legally changed, but still, it worked. Early in her life, she was drawn to jewel tones and bright colors, and as an adult and art teacher, she literally embodied those tones. She would be seen with rainbow streaks in her hair, paint on her face, glitter all over her body, and her clothes. Oh my gosh, her clothes. Frocks of every imaginable shade of the rainbow, brightly colored, feathered, festooned, boas, beads, you name it. And this was her everyday wear. A generation of elementary school students came to know her as the Rainbow Lady and their art teacher. And tons of Seattle people saw her at public events and music festivals, had their pictures taken with her, not just at rainbow-festooned pride celebrations, but all around the town she could be seen dancing, prancing, waving her rainbow umbrellas. So you can imagine that her funeral was standing room only. This woman, this local celebrity, had been known by so many. And her family, in a move of both great generosity and adept strategy, as anyone who's had to tend to the estate of a deceased loved one with too much stuff will appreciate, her family had laid out her frocks on racks and racks and racks in the church fellowship hall. and had also put out rainbow memorabilia from her collection. Anything the family didn't want to hold on to was there for the congregation to take her out into the world. At the end of the service, which, if I remember correctly, also had some jazz in it, there was an invitation to take any of those items with you, to don the robes and boas, to grab the umbrellas, and to begin a funeral procession around the block, New Orleans jazz style. So it started slowly around this block in a mostly residential neighborhood of this church. Now, those blocks aren't as big as Utah blocks, okay? But this neighborhood was hillier than your average Utah neighborhood. So you've got hundreds of people marching out the doors of the church, clad in what looks like basically rainbow bunting and vomit, and slowly moving in a procession, right? With the family and the minister and Dee Dee's ashes, first moving slowly, playing, accompanied by a funeral dirge. And once they got about halfway down the block, around the block, and actually they had gone down the hill, now they were about to start coming back up, the music picked up pace, and the dancing began. And people began waving their boas and pumping their umbrellas up and down in the air, and the assembly turned joyous, and it was a madhouse. And I can only imagine that the passersby, who could tell if they knew what was going on, just shook their heads and said, "Those Unitarians." It was the portion of the funeral, the jazz funeral, the third line that's usually reserved for after the hearse has left the procession and the remains have been interred. But it continued as the procession circled around the block and came back to the memorial garden of the church, where everyone then gathered and Dee Dee's ashes were poured into a common urn along with the ashes of congregants from decades. And the music continued and the dancing went on until the party was done. It was something to see. Something completely outside of my experience of funerals. Growing up a good Midwestern boy in the Plains States, you keep quiet. I didn't see my first dead body until I was in my 20s. And the first time I went to a funeral in the hills of Appalachia and saw children running around and screaming and laughing in the funeral home, I thought it was the most disrespectful thing of the world, until I realized how tightly life and death were woven together in that community, and how little I knew about what celebrating a life could look like. Imagine, if you will, imagine that kind of procession happening here. Out those doors, up 1300, maybe all the way up to the stadium, and then back around through the cemetery and down through 600 and back in here into the memorial garden. What would people do? What would you do? You'd love it? Yeah. How close would it be to the culture of death and life for you personally? For this congregation? For how this community mourns? Would it be okay to laugh and sing and dance while you're crying? This practice, which seems to be tied to a fusion of traditions from West Africa and Haitian voodoo and New Orleans Protestant and Catholic Christianity, this dancing and celebration is a way of pleasing the spirits who protect the dead, as a way of celebrating that life. It's not entirely unprecedented in Unitarian Universalism, right? I mean, we talk about memorial services as celebrations of life. And we often have upbeat music, food, and lots of drinks. Sometimes they're framed as these were the favorite foods and drinks of the person who died. Frankly, oftentimes it feels to me like we're numbing ourselves with that food and drink. But still, the language of doing what they would have wanted and celebrating and listening to the music that they would have liked seems to permeate our understanding of what celebrating life and honoring death is like. And in this way, I suppose it is a way of continuing to live with loss and dance with death. And a way that honors many traditions, such as those of Dia de los Muertos, the Mexican holiday of Day of the Dead, building an ofrenda an offering, a memorial altar decorated with images of the deceased engaged in their favorite activities, along with marigolds and favorite foods and drinks. These traditions have become increasingly familiar and visible, along with candy skulls in recent years, a sign of perhaps increasing multiculturalism or just commercialization and cultural misappropriation. Always a risk, of course, in our consumer colonial capitalist culture. I'm just saying. It seems to me, though, possible that at its best, these may be ways that we as a people and as a nation, and who knows, God willing, maybe even as a species, that we might be developing a more complete and healthy relationship with our finitude. That we might be developing a healthier relationship with death that doesn't glorify it, but also doesn't sanitize it. We might be learning to play with death a little bit. As Unitarian Universalists, diverse though our theologies may be, we rarely publicly celebrate death as a homecoming, an idea of the reunion of the departed with either an otherworldly creator or the spirits of others who have departed, though many of us may long for that, may cherish it in our hearts, or may have been judged out of those beliefs. We rarely explicitly name our deaths and losses, having a tendency to kind of buck up and soldier on. Maybe the political losses, but the personal ones? This can be true of us individually, as families, as communities, as congregations. Our cultures around death and grieving shape us. They inform how we live as well as how we die. My training as a hospital chaplain and a spiritual director tells me that getting current on our grief work is an important way to stay healthy, to pay attention to the losses of our lives, to create a timeline, if you will, and look at all of the loss that you've experienced in your life. Again, not to wallow in it, but to do the work of mourning, to honor what you have lost and what losses have shaped you, to grieve them as you go. This is an important way to live currently with greater intention and presence and clarity and consciousness, and a deeper, more grounded, authentic, and abundant life. The contemporary teacher Eckhart Tolle talks quite a bit in his text, Stillness Speaks, about death and more meaningful living. At one point, he talks about going into a forest and looking at decaying trees and saying, if you look closer, you'll see that there is life emerging amidst that death. And he finishes by saying, if we look close enough, we'll see that death is not the opposite of life. Death is the opposite of birth. Life has no opposite. It is eternal. Elsewhere, he says, whenever any kind of deep loss occurs in your life, something inside you dies. You feel diminished in your sense of who you are, and you may have a certain sense of disorientation, asking, without this, who am I? When a form that you'd identified with as a part of yourself leaves or dissolves, it can be extremely painful, and it leaves a hole in the fabric of your existence. But when this happens, don't deny it or ignore the pain or sadness you feel. Accept that it is there. And beware of your mind's tendency to construct a story around that loss in which you are assigned the role of a victim. Instead, can you simply face and accept this strange emptiness? If you do, you may find that it is no longer a fearful place. You may be surprised to find peace emanating from it. He concludes by saying, whenever death occurs, whenever a life form dissolves, God, the formless and unmanifested, shines through the opening left in that dissolving form. That is why the peace of God can come to you through the contemplation and acceptance of death. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is the opposite of birth. Life has no opposite. Life is eternal. I would add, Sure, we are born and we die. These finite, separate, embodied selves. And the lives we know as us and ours will come to an end. It is foolish to think otherwise, though certainly understandable and self-protective. Perhaps we could all benefit from a little bit of that corpse meditation that Tom mentioned earlier. As a matter of fact, I've got one. Yeah, not a corpse. Not a corpse. I tried. I'm sorry. It was hard on short notice. This is actually from a text by Thich Nhat Hanh, contemporary Vietnamese Buddhist teacher, from a revised version of the Blooming of the Lotus. And it's an exercise he calls impermanence, looking deeply and healing. He says this exercise helps us to come face to face with the anxieties and fears that are buried deep in our unconscious and that transform themselves into latent tendencies that Buddhists call anusaya. In principle, he says, we all know very well we cannot avoid growing old, getting sick, dying, being separated, but we do not want to give attention to those things. We don't want to be in touch with the anxiety and the fear attached to those, and so we let them sleep in our minds. That's why they're called anusaya, literally meaning lying asleep along with. So these things are lying asleep along with us. And though they're lying asleep in our hearts, they follow us and they influence us. Such that when we hear people speaking about it, or we are witness to age or sickness or death, we have a tendency to avoid them and repress them, and this waters them and gives them deeper roots and more strength. Instead, he says, follow the exercise of the Buddha, who taught that instead of repressing these, we should invite them into our consciousness, recognize them, welcome them, begin practicing mindful breathing, and simply acknowledging their presence as they rise to us. When a fear shows up, greet it with a smile as you would a friend. And quite naturally, it will begin to lose some of its energy, so that when it returns to our subconscious, it will be much weaker. So, I'm going to read you some of the phrases that Thich Nhat Hanh suggests that we use. And each phrase will be punctuated by a chime. I'll invite you to make yourself comfortable. If closing your eyes is comfortable for you, I invite you to do that. And to first become more fully aware just of the sensation of being in your body and feeling your breath rise in and out. Remaining conscious of the sensations of breath and body. Notice, too, what sensations move through you in thought and being at these words. Knowing I will get old, I breathe in. Knowing I can't escape old age, I breathe out. Getting old, no escape. Knowing I will get sick, I breathe in. Knowing I can't escape sickness, I breathe out. Getting sick, no escape. Knowing I will die, I breathe in. Knowing I can't escape death, I breathe out. Dying, no escape. knowing that human species and our civilization will die, I breathe in. Knowing that our civilization cannot escape death, I breathe out. Death of civilization, no escape. Knowing that one day I will have to abandon all that I cherish today, I breathe in. Knowing that I can't escape having to abandon all that I cherish today, I breathe out. Abandoning what I cherish, no escape. Knowing that my actions are my only belongings, I breathe in. Knowing that I cannot escape the consequences of my actions, I breathe out. Actions, true belongings, no escape from consequences. Determined to live my days deeply in mindfulness, I breathe in. Seeing the joy and the benefit of living mindfully, I breathe out. Living mindfully, seeing joy. Vowing to offer joy each day to my beloved, I breathe in. Vowing to ease the pain of my beloved, I breathe out. Offering joy, easing pain. I invite you to return your awareness to this room. Again, your breath, this community. A few weeks ago, Tom posed a question of what do we do with our feelings? This, I would suggest, is one important option. To pay attention to them. Find ways to accept and acknowledge and embrace our emotions, especially those tied to our finitude, our fear, our vulnerability, the limits of our power. This can clear the way to more intentional, mindful living with greater integrity and courage, to live, as Jesus spoke, life in abundance. Perhaps we can learn at this time of transition and turning to better and more gracefully live with loss and maybe even dance with death. With that intention and hope, I invite you to join in singing our closing hymn. It's number 306, Sing of Living, Sing of Dying. living and dying, giving and deepened, open and searching, helping and suffering, we return to the world that we need, that needs us, with light and warmth, with knowledge and freedom, and with faith, hope, and love. Go in peace, my friends, and make peace, and dance.